I returned from my father's funeral with the kind of heaviness that clings to the bones, a weight that doesn't simply sit on the skin, but sinks deeper, anchoring itself in the marrow as if grief were something physical, something with fingers and breath and pulse. The drive back home felt like drifting through a world slightly out of focus, where colors seemed dimmed and every sound arrived a second too late, as if life itself struggled to keep pace with the shock etched into my chest. My father's passing hadn't been unexpected, but loss has a strange way of arriving like a thief anyway, stealing the last fragments of certainty you thought you had and scattering them to the wind. By the time I reached my sister's house, where she had insisted I stay for a few days so I wouldn't return to an empty apartment, I felt like a hollowed-out version of myself, someone whose footsteps no longer fully belonged to them, someone drifting through the fog of morning without a map. Her home was warm, filled with soft lamplight and the scent of something sweet lingering in the air, a stark contrast to the cold echo of the funeral home I had left behind only hours earlier. I remember pausing at the doorway, taking a breath, as if the simple act of crossing the threshold might break the fragile dam I had built inside myself. But I stepped forward anyway, letting the warmth wash over me as the door closed gently behind my back. My sister greeted me with a hug that trembled with exhaustion, her eyes red and swollen in a way that mirrored my own, and for a moment we simply stood there holding on to each other, two siblings trying desperately to anchor themselves in something familiar as the world shifted beneath their feet. She murmured something about getting me tea and slipped into the kitchen, leaving me alone in the softly lit living room where framed family photos lined the walls and shelves like tiny memorials to better days. I walked slowly, tracing the edges of those images with my gaze. My father laughing at a barbecue, my sister's wedding day, the three of us on a beach decades ago. Each photograph a window into a time untouched by grief. I felt the kind of ache that expands gradually, like a tide rising in the chest, and I sank into the couch before it could push me completely under. My body felt drained, not just tired but emptied, as though some essential part of me had been left behind at the graveside, and now only the shell remained. My sister returned with a steaming mug and placed it gently into my hands, and for a brief moment, the warmth seeped into my palms and grounded me in a reality that felt dangerously close to slipping away. She sat beside me, speaking softly about arrangements and paperwork, about how surreal it all still felt, and I nodded along, my thoughts drifting in and out like a signal struggling to stay connected. When she finally stood and said her husband wanted to talk with me when I felt ready, I assumed it was about logistics, maybe something related to the estate, and I told her I'd see him soon, unaware that a subtle tension had flickered across her features before she turned away. I remained on the couch for what felt like a long time, staring at the mug in my hands as steam curled upward in faint, ghost-like spirals. My mind kept replaying the moment the casket lowered into the ground, the dull thud of dirt striking wood, the silent trembling of my sister beside me, the weight of finality pressing down so heavily it felt like it reshaped the air around us. I found myself wondering whether grief always came in waves, or if sometimes it simply settled permanently, like sediment in the bottom of a river, changing the flow forever. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood, sounds that felt strangely amplified in the hush of the evening. When I finally rose from the couch and headed down the hallway toward the guest room, I felt a strange shift in the air, something subtle but undeniable, like the atmosphere had thickened just slightly. My sister's husband was standing near the doorway of his office, leaning against the frame with a strange expression on his face, a mixture of hesitation and urgency that didn't quite fit the circumstances of the day. His eyes followed me with an intensity that made me pause, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us with a tension I hadn't anticipated. He gestured me closer, his voice low and steady, stripped of the usual warmth he greeted me with, and something in his posture made my pulse quicken ever so slightly. I took a slow breath and stepped toward him, expecting a discussion about finances or family responsibilities, but as I approached, an uneasy feeling tugged at the back of my mind, a sense that whatever he wanted to say wasn't logistical at all. He exhaled sharply, almost as if bracing himself, and then he spoke words that sliced through the quiet and shifted everything inside me in a single instant. "Now we can finally talk." The sentence hung in the air with a peculiar weight, as if layered with meaning I didn't yet understand, and a chill rippled down my spine despite the warmth of the hallway. His eyes didn't waver, and something in his expression told me this conversation had been waiting, poised like a shadow at the edge of the room, for longer than I realized. I felt the echo of those words reverberate inside my chest, stirring unease and curiosity in equal measure, and instinctively I glanced toward the kitchen where my sister was still moving about, unaware of the strange gravity settling in the space just outside her view. It struck me then how fragile moments of transition could be, how you could walk through a house filled with grief and memories only to find yourself stepping into something entirely different, something unexpected and unnerving. The hallway seemed to narrow slightly, or perhaps it was my perception tightening, sharpening under the weight of whatever truth he felt ready to reveal now that my father was gone. A part of me wanted to step back, to retreat into the safety of the living room, to sink once again into the couch where grief was familiar and heavy, but at least predictable. But another part, the part still raw and searching, desperate for clarity or connection or meaning in the wake of loss, urged me to hear whatever he had to say. Grief does strange things to the mind, opening doors you might normally keep tightly shut, and in that moment I felt myself suspended between reluctance and a quiet, trembling readiness. His gaze remained steady, unwavering, and I realized he was waiting for me to respond, to give him permission to continue, though the urgency in his posture suggested that whatever he had held back for so long was pressing against him now with increasing force. Before I could speak, before I could even steady myself, he shifted slightly closer, lowering his voice in a way that felt almost conspiratorial, as though the walls themselves might listen if he wasn't careful. It occurred to me that grief often exposes the undercurrents of a family, the secrets, the tensions, the truths that ripple beneath the surface and only break through when the structure that held everything together finally collapses. My father had been that structure in many ways, the anchor that kept our family from drifting too far into the unknown. And now that he was gone, it seemed as though something long kept in the shadows was ready to force itself into the light. I stood there, feeling the gravity of his words settling like a storm cloud preparing to break, the air thick with anticipation and something else, something unspoken and unsettling. And yet, despite the unease prickling along my spine, a quiet voice inside me whispered that maybe, just maybe, this conversation would lead somewhere necessary, somewhere that might help me make sense of the fragments of my life now scattered around me like pieces of a broken mirror. As I inhaled slowly, trying to steady the tremor in my chest, I became aware of how strange it felt to be balanced between two worlds, the world of mourning, heavy and suffocating, and this new, uncertain world unfolding before me with an intensity I couldn't name. The two emotions tangled inside me, amplifying each other until it felt like the hallway was spinning gently, like grief and curiosity had joined hands and pulled the ground out from beneath me. I let out the breath I'd been holding and nodded for him to continue, though I wasn't entirely sure I was ready for whatever truth he carried. But grief has a way of breaking open the rigid parts of a soul, and I found myself standing there, open and vulnerable, waiting for a revelation I could sense was far more personal than anything related to logistics or paperwork. And as I stood there, suspended in the thickening silence, I felt the emotional tide inside me shift once more, creating a space where the viewers of this very story, those sharing this moment with me, could step closer, could feel the same tension knotting the air. So if you're watching this, if you're here with me in this strange, fragile pause between one life chapter and the next, I want to ask you something personal. What do you think he meant by those words? What do you think he'd been waiting to say? Share your thoughts in the comments, because in moments like these, hearing from others can feel like a lifeline when the world goes dim. That tension hung between us as I waited for him to speak, but before he continued, I found myself drifting inward again, feeling the raw pain of my father's loss settle deeper in my chest, as though the emotional earthquake of this day had fractured something fundamental inside me. I needed stability, clarity, something to anchor onto in this storm of grief and uncertainty. And maybe, just maybe, this conversation would provide that, even if only in an unexpected way. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, feel the weight of the moment pressing down, and I realized there was no turning back. This was the threshold my life was waiting at, and I had no choice but to step through it. If you're still with me, walking this emotional path by my side, I want to say something directly from my heart. Thank you. Moments like these are heavy, and having someone to share the journey with matters more than you know. And before this first act closes, before we step deeper into the unfolding truth, I want to invite you to subscribe, not out of obligation, but because stories like this, stories about family, grief, secrets, and healing, can only truly be lived when shared together. So if you want to keep walking with me into the next chapter of this emotional and cinematic journey, make sure you're subscribed. The night after my father's funeral stretched endlessly, a quiet expanse that seemed to absorb every trace of warmth and familiarity I once knew. The house had fallen into that peculiar silence that comes only after too many tears and too few words, the kind of silence that hums faintly, as though it's alive, carrying the weight of unspoken memories through the walls. My sister had retreated to her room, her door closed, a thin strip of dim light beneath it the only proof that she was still awake. I remained in the hallway, frozen between the living room and the unknown, staring at her husband as his expression hardened into something I couldn't quite name, part determination, part fear, part relief. There was no going back. He had opened the door to a conversation that demanded to be heard. I followed him into his office, the small lamp on his desk casting a pool of golden light that barely touched the corners of the room. The space smelled faintly of paper, cologne, and something else. Something old, almost metallic, like dust stirred from forgotten things. He motioned for me to sit, and I did, though my body resisted, my pulse quickening as I tried to prepare myself for whatever truth he had carried silently through the years. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tightly, eyes fixed on the floor. For a moment, he said nothing, only exhaled slowly, the air trembling slightly between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured, each word deliberate, as though he feared the weight of them might shatter the fragile stillness of the night. He said that he had been waiting for this moment, not because he wanted my father gone, but because there were things he could not say while he was still alive. He said my father had kept secrets, deep and deliberate, not out of malice, but out of protection, or perhaps guilt. I listened, each word sinking like a stone into the still water of my mind. He said that what he was about to tell me would change the way I remembered my father, and though a part of me wanted to protest, to cover my ears and preserve the fragile image of the man who had raised me, another part, the one that had always sensed something hidden beneath my father's stoic calm, was ready. He spoke of a time before I was born, when my father had worked for a private research company, a quiet facility on the outskirts of town that no one ever seemed to talk about. He said that my father had been brilliant, meticulous, trusted with projects that required secrecy, but that one of those projects had gone wrong, catastrophically wrong. There had been an accident, a fire, something buried and forgotten by time, and though the world never knew the details, the survivors carried the scars. My father, he said, had walked away with more than physical wounds. He carried the burden of something he could never undo, something that had haunted him for decades. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, the air thickening as pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known existed began to shift inside my head. My father had always been private, but I had mistaken his silence for modesty, his distance for discipline. I never imagined it was guilt. My sister's husband paused, studying my reaction, then continued. He said that my father had once been close with another man, his research partner, a name he hesitated to say, who had died in that same fire. And then he said something that made my breath catch and the room spin ever so slightly. The man who died had a child, and that child had survived the fire because my father had pulled them from the wreckage. That child, he said quietly, was me. The words crashed through me with a force that made my stomach twist. I felt my entire being fracture, disbelief colliding with grief, confusion merging with an ache that felt ancient, as though my body had always known something wasn't quite right, but had never had the courage to name it. I wanted to speak, to deny it, but the look in his eyes told me it wasn't a story invented for comfort or drama. It was truth, raw and irreversible. The room seemed to shrink around me. My mind spiraled back through the years, through every childhood moment that suddenly felt strange in hindsight. My father's hesitation whenever I asked about old photographs, the way he'd glance at my face with something that looked like longing and regret intertwined, the way he never spoke about the years before my birth. The puzzle pieces began to align, jagged and terrible in their clarity. I wasn't his biological child. I was the living echo of another man's life, a reminder of a tragedy that had shaped him in ways I never understood. And yet, he had raised me with love, with quiet devotion, never letting that truth slip even once. My sister's husband told me he had discovered the truth accidentally, years ago, when my father's health began to decline, and he had helped organize some of his personal documents. He had found letters, old, brittle, written in my father's unmistakable handwriting, confessing everything in words soaked with sorrow. He said he had wanted to tell me, but my father had begged him not to, insisting it would destroy the fragile peace our family had built. I sat there in silence, the sound of my heartbeat filling the space between us. I didn't know what to feel: betrayal, gratitude, love, or loss. All of them crashed together until I could hardly breathe. When I finally spoke, my voice was barely a whisper. I asked why now, why he had chosen this moment, just after the funeral. His answer was simple: because now it was safe. Because my father had written a final letter addressed to me, one that could only be opened after his death. He reached into the desk drawer, pulling out an envelope that looked worn from being handled too many times. My name was written on it in my father's familiar script, precise, careful, unmistakably his. My fingers trembled as I took it, the weight of the paper far heavier than it should have been. I didn't open it right away. I couldn't. I sat there staring at the curve of my name, remembering every moment of my life that had now shifted beneath the gravity of this revelation. The house was utterly silent, except for the faint ticking of a clock somewhere down the hall. My sister's husband sat back, his expression solemn but relieved, as though he had finally unburdened himself of a truth that had haunted him almost as much as it had haunted my father. He told me that he had loved my sister too much to betray her father's final wishes, but he couldn't bear the thought of me living the rest of my life in ignorance, believing in a version of the past that wasn't true. I understood, even through the shock. And as much as I wanted to run from it, a quiet voice inside me told me that truth, no matter how painful, was a form of love, the final, difficult gift the living could offer the dead. I went to my room that night, carrying the letter like something sacred and dangerous at once. I sat on the edge of the bed, the envelope resting in my lap, my heart pounding with a rhythm that felt too loud in the stillness. For a long time, I couldn't bring myself to break the seal. My mind kept circling around the idea that maybe this letter would explain everything, that maybe it would offer a kind of closure that no funeral ever could. But beneath that hope was fear. fear of what it might confirm, fear of what it might destroy. When I finally tore it open, the paper crackled softly, and the smell of old ink rose like memory itself. The letter began simply with my name. My father, or the man who had raised me as his own, wrote that he had carried the truth for too long, that every time he looked at me, he saw not a reminder of his past mistakes, but the possibility of redemption. He said he had once failed a friend, failed to save a man who had trusted him. But in saving me, he had found a reason to live, a way to honor what was lost. He apologized for the silence, for the deception, for every time he had withheld pieces of the story that was rightfully mine. But more than anything, he wrote about love, how it had transcended blood, how it had shaped every decision he'd made since that night. He told me I was his child in every way that mattered, and that he hoped one day I would understand why he had chosen silence over confession. By the time I finished reading, tears had blurred the ink, my breath hitching with a strange mixture of sorrow and gratitude. The truth had shattered something inside me, yes, but it had also illuminated a deeper bond, one forged not by birth, but by choice. My father had been both my rescuer and my guardian, and even in his secrecy, he had been guided by love. I folded the letter carefully, pressing it to my chest, feeling the warmth of it seep into my skin like a final embrace from someone who had loved too deeply to ever let go completely. That night, sleep came in fragments, haunted by dreams of fire and water, of a child being carried through smoke, of a man with kind eyes whispering promises into the darkness. I woke before dawn, the world still gray and quiet, and stepped outside into the cool air. The first light was creeping over the horizon, painting everything in soft gold, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt something like peace flicker faintly in my chest. But I also knew the story wasn't over. My sister didn't know the truth, and the decision of whether to tell her weighed heavily on me. The letter had given me understanding, but it had also given me responsibility, the kind that tests the core of who you are. I stood there on the porch, watching the light spread across the sky, feeling the weight of the world balance delicately in my hands, and I knew that whatever came next would define the rest of my life. If you followed me this far, if you felt the ache and the revelation alongside me, I want to ask you something important before we move forward. Should I tell my sister the truth? Should I honor my father's silence, or break it for the sake of honesty? Let me know your thoughts in the comments because your voice, your insight, might help me find the courage to face what comes next. Before I continue, if you've been walking beside me through this long emotional path, through the grief, the truth, the letter, and the silence that followed, I want to ask you from my heart, make sure you're subscribed. Not just to hear the rest of my story, but because stories like this, about family, forgiveness, and rediscovering who we are, mean more when they're shared. Now, let's keep going. The morning after I read the letter, the world felt eerily still, as though time itself had paused to give me space to decide what to do next. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that hums faintly under the weight of untold words. My sister was in the kitchen. I could hear her moving gently, the soft clinking of cups and the low hum of the kettle, unaware that the world she knew, the family she believed she had, was on the edge of something irreversible. I sat on the edge of the bed holding the letter again, the paper now soft from being folded and unfolded too many times, its words burned into my memory like etchings carved into stone. Every sentence my father wrote had become a pulse inside me, an ache, a comfort, a question. The question was no longer whether the truth should be told, but whether I was strong enough to bear what telling it might bring. When I stepped into the hallway, my sister turned toward me, eyes tired but kind, and for a moment I almost lost my nerve. She looked fragile in a way she hadn't before, like the days of mourning had hollowed her out too. leaving her clinging to any scrap of normalcy she could find. I wanted to protect her from what I knew, to hold the lie like a shield. But as she smiled weakly and asked if I'd slept, I felt the words rise unbidden, an invisible hand pushing them toward my lips. The truth, once awakened, has a life of its own. I told her we needed to talk. She nodded slowly, sensing something in my tone that stripped the air of its calm. We sat at the table, and for a moment, the morning light bathed everything in a golden hush, the kind of light that feels like forgiveness, even before the wounds are fully healed. I told her everything. Slowly at first, carefully, as if the story itself might break under too much weight. I told her about our father's research, the fire, the friend who died, the child who survived, and the secret that had been buried beneath years of silence. I told her about the letter, about the truth that had rewritten our past. As I spoke, I watched her face shift from confusion to disbelief to something deeper. Not anger, not betrayal, but sorrow so profound it felt sacred. She covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming silently down her cheeks, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. The world seemed to narrow until it was just the two of us and the truth, sitting heavily in the space between. When she finally found her voice, it was quiet but steady. She said she had always felt there was something different about the way our father looked at me. Not less love, but more intensity, as though he saw in me something fragile, something that reminded him of a part of himself he could never quite forgive. She said that sometimes she had caught him standing in the doorway of my room when I was a child, not saying a word, just watching as if memorizing the shape of my breathing. She had thought it was worry or affection, but now she understood it was memory, the echo of a promise he had made long ago. Her tears fell freely now, but there was no bitterness in them, only compassion. And in that moment I realized how strong she truly was. We sat for hours, talking through every fragment of the story, piecing together the life of the man we both loved but never fully understood. The grief that had once felt suffocating began to shift, transforming into something gentler, an understanding that love, even when tangled in secrecy, is still love. My sister said that she was grateful I had told her, even though it hurt, because truth, however heavy, gives meaning to the pain. She reached across the table and took my hand, and in that small gesture there was forgiveness, acceptance, and the quiet acknowledgement that family is built not only from blood, but from the choice to keep loving through the fractures. As the day unfolded, we found ourselves going through my father's old belongings together. Each photograph, each note, each worn object became a thread in a story that now stretched wider and deeper than we had ever imagined. We found a small box at the back of his closet, one neither of us had seen before. Inside was a watch, the glass cracked but still ticking faintly, and a photograph, a man with kind eyes standing beside a younger version of my father, both smiling in the glow of some long-forgotten laboratory light. On the back of the photo were words written in faded ink. For the future we could not save, but may yet honor. My sister looked at me, and I knew she saw it too, that this man, this ghost from the past, was the one whose legacy I unknowingly carried. We decided to visit the site where it had all happened, the facility on the outskirts of town that had burned so many years ago. It was a strange impulse, but it felt necessary, as though walking through the ashes might finally close the circle. The drive there was quiet, filled only with the hum of the road and the steady rhythm of our breathing. When we arrived, the place was little more than ruins now, reclaimed by weeds and time. The walls that remained were cracked, the air heavy with the scent of earth and rust, but there was a stillness there that felt almost sacred. I walked slowly among the remains, feeling the ground shift beneath my shoes, as though the past were breathing just beneath the surface. My sister stood beside me, silent, and for a moment I imagined my father standing there too, watching, relieved that the truth had finally found its way into the open. I knelt by what must have once been the entrance and placed the letter there, weighed down by a small stone. I whispered something I didn't fully plan, a promise maybe or a prayer, thanking my father for saving me, for loving me enough to bear the burden of silence, for giving me a life that had meaning even when built on hidden foundations. The wind stirred gently, carrying the scent of pine and smoke, and in that sound I thought I heard something, a faint whisper, or maybe just memory exhaling at last. The pain didn't vanish, but it softened, reshaped into gratitude. When we drove home, the sun was setting in deep amber light, the horizon painted with streaks of fire and calm, as though the world itself had exhaled too. My sister leaned her head against the window, eyes half closed, and I realized that grief, once shared, becomes lighter, not gone, but transformed into something you can carry without breaking. I thought about my father's letter again, about how love sometimes hides behind silence, not to deceive but to protect. And I knew then that I would keep his memory not as the man who lied, but as the man who loved enough to carry the truth until I was strong enough to bear it. That night, the house felt different, not empty, not haunted, but alive with something new. We lit a candle for him on the windowsill, the flame flickering softly against the glass, and I realized that closure doesn't come all at once. It arrives slowly, in breaths, in small understandings, in the way light filters through grief and finds what's still beautiful. I thought about how his last words in the letter, "I hope one day you'll forgive me and live freely in the truth I could not tell," had become a prophecy fulfilled. The journey had brought me to a place I never expected, peace. It wasn't the absence of pain, but the transformation of it. And as I looked at my sister, at the soft glow of the candlelight, I felt something like my father's presence linger there. Not as a ghost, but as warmth, as memory, as love. Now, before we move into the final part of this story, the reflection, the closing of the emotional circle, I want to thank you again for being here, for walking with me through every shadow and every flicker of light. If you haven't yet, subscribe, because the last act, the conclusion, is where everything finds its meaning, where grief becomes gratitude, and where love, despite everything, endures. The days that followed unfolded slowly, as if time itself had softened to let us breathe again. The funeral had already become a distant echo, replaced by mornings filled with quiet reflection and evenings where the light spilled gently through the curtains, painting the walls in gold. The house no longer felt haunted by loss. It had become a space where memory lived, where love could linger without turning to pain. My sister and I had started speaking about our father with a kind of tenderness we hadn't known before, as though the truth had stripped away everything false and left behind something purer, something real. There was no bitterness anymore, only understanding. The realization that life is made of layers we can't always see, and sometimes what we mistake for silence is really sacrifice. I began to see my father differently in those quiet days. Not as the figure of perfection I once believed in, but as a human being, flawed, afraid, trying to mend something broken by doing the only thing he knew how, loving fiercely and silently. I understood now that his secrecy wasn't betrayal, but devotion. It was the act of a man who believed that protecting the people he loved was worth the burden of his own guilt. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it gave it shape. A shape I could hold, study, and finally accept. There was something freeing in that acceptance. Grief, I discovered, is not about learning to let go of those we've lost. It's about learning to carry them differently. Not on our backs as a weight, but within us as light. My sister and I began to rebuild our days around small rituals of remembrance. Every Sunday, we'd make tea and sit on the porch, reading fragments of the letters he had written over the years. Some were notes we had found tucked inside old books. Others were lines scribbled on napkins or scraps of paper. They weren't profound or poetic, but they were honest. Words about ordinary things, about the weather, about how much he loved seeing us laugh. We realized that he had been saying goodbye to us long before he ever left, not through grand gestures, but through moments of quiet care that we had once overlooked. In those words, I could hear his voice again, calm, patient, steady, and it no longer hurt. It felt like home. One afternoon, I found myself back at the cemetery, standing before the grave that had once felt like a wall between us. Now, it felt more like a door. The sky was vast and blue, the kind of blue that feels infinite, and the air carried the faint scent of rain and earth. I placed a single white flower on the stone and stood there for a long time, letting the silence speak. I told him, not aloud, but in the space between heartbeats, that I forgave him, that I understood, that I loved him not for the man he had been, but for the man he had tried to become. I told him that the truth he feared would destroy us had instead set us free. I promised to honor him not by mourning forever, but by living fully. The wind stirred gently then, brushing against my cheek like a familiar touch, and I smiled through tears that no longer burned. When I returned home, my sister was waiting with old photo albums spread across the table. We spent the evening flipping through them, laughing softly at memories that once felt too painful to touch. In those photographs, I saw not just our family, but the legacy of love that my father had left behind. Love that had survived fire, secrets, and death itself. I realized then that family isn't defined by the truths we hide or the blood that binds us, but by the way we show up for one another when everything else falls apart. My father's silence had once felt like a shadow, but now I saw it as proof of how deeply he had loved. So deeply that he had carried an unbearable truth to his grave, believing it was the only way to protect us. And maybe, in his own imperfect way, he had been right. In the weeks that followed, I started writing again, something I hadn't done since before he died. I wrote not about loss, but about transformation, about how grief can be both an ending and a beginning. Each word felt like a thread, weaving the past and present together, creating something new from everything broken. My sister encouraged me to share what I wrote, to let others find their reflection in my story. And slowly I realized that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means turning pain into something that can light the way for someone else. There was one last thing I needed to do before I could truly move forward. I returned to the ruins of the old facility one final time, this time alone. The place was quiet, the air cool and still, and the stone I had placed on the letter was still there, though the paper beneath it had begun to fade into the earth. I knelt down and whispered my gratitude. To my father, to the man who had given me life, to the universe that had somehow bound us all together in the fragile miracle of survival. The truth, once unbearable, now felt like peace. I realized that I wasn't defined by bloodlines or history, but by love, the kind that endures across fire and silence, the kind that transforms pain into understanding. As I stood to leave, the sky opened into a brilliant sunset, the horizon painted in colors so vivid they felt alive. It was one of those rare moments where everything, past, present, and future, seemed to converge into stillness. I took a deep breath, and in that breath, I felt my father's presence not as a ghost, but as part of me. For the first time since the funeral, I felt whole. When I returned home, my sister was sitting on the porch with 2 cups of tea waiting. We didn't speak much that evening. We didn't need to. The quiet between us was no longer heavy with things unsaid. It was full of peace, of shared memory, of love that had survived everything. We watched the stars appear one by one, the sky darkening into the same endless mystery my father used to talk about when I was small. I realized that this was how healing begins, not with answers, but with acceptance. Now, as I sit here sharing this with you, I want you to know that every story of loss can become a story of light if you let it. We all carry our own versions of silence, our own hidden truths, our own fires that have shaped us. But beneath all of it, there is love. And love, once understood, never truly dies. If my story has reached you, if you've felt the pulse of it somewhere deep inside, then take this moment with you. Let it remind you that even in the darkest grief, there's a seed of redemption waiting quietly to bloom. And if you've lost someone, if you're still learning how to breathe through the ache, I hope you find peace in knowing that love doesn't end where life does. It changes shape, but it never disappears. So, if this story touched you, if you felt the warmth of recognition or the quiet echo of your own memories in it, I invite you to stay, to like, to subscribe, to keep walking with me through stories that search for light in the shadow, because every ending is only a beginning written in softer ink. And as the last candle flickers out, as the night settles gently around this chapter of my life, I can finally say it, not with sadness, but with gratitude. I returned from my father's funeral thinking my world had ended. But it was only then, through loss, through truth, through love, that my life truly began.